All right, well, welcome to the first of our summer podcast interviews for the Auburn Christian Student Center. As many of you might have heard, since we can't be in person this summer, the staff thought that it'd be better. And so if you guys hearing me teach through different series, if instead I interview different people with different perspectives on different topics and that we release those. And so once a week for the next about 7 or 8 weeks, we'll be releasing some interviews for you guys on a wide range of topics. And some of the people that I interview will have a connection with the ACSC. Like today, we have Michael Strickland, who's a former student at the ACSC and a former intern. And others will not have a connection. But they've all been chosen for a reason, and they've all been chosen because the staff thinks that they have something to share that will be helpful to the college students in our ministry and to any others who might be watching this. So before we jump too far into it, let me just say that the reason I wanted to speak with Michael is that both, not both, but as a student, as an intern, as a minister, now as a professor, and he'll unpack that a little bit in a second, he has spent his life walking with Jesus, explaining Jesus, thinking through the claims that Jesus makes on his life, but also on other people's lives. And our ministry has a long history and a long commitment to making sure that the college students in it encounter Jesus. And so that's why we studied through the Gospel of Mark the last 2 years. And a couple years before that, I did the Gospel of John. And my predecessor, Jim, taught through Gospels almost constantly. And so because of that commitment, we thought it'd be great for our first interview to be about Jesus and encountering Jesus, and how someone like Michael has had his life shaped by Jesus. And as he spent his life studying Jesus, how his views of Jesus might have changed and altered. So, Michael, just at the beginning, why don't you explain what years you're at Auburn, kind of what you do now and how you got there? Just take a couple of minutes and explain that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I started Auburn in the fall of '92, and I grew up in Moulton, Alabama, and so I started the fall of 1992, and I graduated in '97, which, if you're doing the math, that's 5 years. However, I did like many do and changed my major from chemical engineering to math somewhere along the way. And while I was at Auburn at the ACSC, I met my now wife, Mary. She was Mary Robinson then. She's Mary Strickland now. She's a couple years younger than I am. And from 97 to 99, I was an intern there at the ACSC, and finished a master's in math education at Auburn, and began a master's in biblical studies at Lipscomb during that time. After we left there, I ministered in churches in Alabama and Tennessee, and eventually finished my PhD in theology at the University of Birmingham, England. For the past 7 years, I've been teaching for Amridge University, which is formerly Southern Christian University, formerly Alabama Christian School of Religion, which is where Jim Brinkerhoff got his master's in biblical studies, and several other big names in our brotherhood have. Anyway, I've been teaching at Amridge for 7 years now. I was a campus minister with Raiders for Christ at Middle Tennessee State University from 2005 to 2009, and that's in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. My family and I have stayed in Murfreesboro since I got out of campus ministry in 2009.
Awesome. Well, I think most people watching this will know, and if you're not, you maybe have already connected the dots, but Jim Brinkerhoff was who I was speaking about earlier when I said Jim. And Jim was my predecessor. He was the campus minister at the ACSC for almost 3 decades, right shy of it. Passed away in 2013. But Jim had a big impact upon my life as my campus minister. And as Michael mentioned, he was Michael's campus minister and mentor and friend. And so let's just begin with you coming into college, encountering Jim, but set that up a little bit. You became a Christian in high school. Is that right? And so when did you first kind of start studying Jesus as a non-believer, or however you would categorize yourself in high school? And what did you find compelling about Jesus at that time?
Okay, great. Yeah, so I grew up in a nominally Christian family. I'd say my parents definitely instilled certain values in me, and I had a loving family. They made mistakes, but we all make mistakes, so I'm not terribly critical of my parents. We weren't a church-going family, I did go to church some. My parents would actually take me to church and drop me off, my sister and I. And it was actually in high school when I hadn't been to church in several years. I started dating a girl at the Moulton Church of Christ in Moulton, Alabama. And that relationship fizzled. However, my relationship with the church didn't. And I have to admit, while I certainly began to form beliefs and, my understanding of Jesus was being shaped then, I wouldn't say that Jesus was the primary factor in my coming to Jesus at that moment. And more than anything, it was the love of the youth group and the church there that really helped me kind of envision what my life was supposed to be about. So it's not that Jesus wasn't a part of that, but I'd say that most of my faith was formed around, hey, I'm at a good church, I'm at the right church, and some wonderful Christian people there. And I had not grown up intending going to Auburn. In fact, we were an Alabama family. But a few of the people in the youth group at the Moulton Church of Christ who are a year older than me were already Auburn students, and they kept talking about the Auburn Christian Student Center. And so when I got a scholarship to attend Auburn, that kind of sealed the deal, because I knew I wanted to be part of the ACSC. I wasn't even an Auburn fan at first. Now that changed. Actually changed at the very first game I was at. I was like, hey, why am I going to root for another team? And so since then I've been diehard Auburn. Don't get me wrong, I bleed orange and blue now, but I just didn't grow up with it, and my family does. Okay, so I'm good. But it was at the Christian Student Center where I've really had my first true encounter with Jesus. And I just mean that in the sense that from the minute that I became involved, I had community in a way that, a new way, a special way. And it was formative for me, don't get me wrong. But especially through the direction of Jim Brinkerhoff, who's calling me to see that to be a Christian means that you're following Jesus, and to truly pay attention to what that meant. And so that was where I really started to understand that to be a Christian is really to find yourself in relationship to Jesus. So really, it was those first years of college that were life-changing for me.
Yeah.
And it started in Moulton, so don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to downplay that. But when you specifically ask about Jesus, that's where my real relationship with Jesus blossomed.
And I don't think that's uncommon. That's certainly my story. I came to Auburn. I didn't know about the ACSC. I didn't know about Jim. I think I've told the story before to people, but the first time I saw him teach, he was in blue jean shorts, and he had like socks and sandals, and and his shirt was tucked in, and jokingly I say I would have thought he was like a tourist from Germany, not the campus minister at Auburn University. But like you're describing, when I came into college, I didn't have this understanding of Jesus. I didn't see my faith as about following him as much as it was about believing a set of beliefs, of propositions, of doctrines. And so I think it's not an uncommon experience for Christians to have, in some sense, given their allegiance to Jesus, in some sense, believing in Jesus, in some sense, claiming they're Christians, Jesus followers, but have never really wrestled with who Jesus is and encountered him through a careful study of the Gospels. And so when Jim was teaching through it, when he was presenting Jesus to you and you're having that reshaped, you said earlier that, it kind of reshaped your understanding of being a Christian, that following Jesus, but can you flesh that out any? How did that shape your life? How did your view of Jesus change? Or maybe it just even come into focus rather than changing?
Yeah, so I'd say that I had been taught to gauge my Christianity as, whether or not it was the most biblical. So whether or not, as you said, it fit certain criteria that were, maybe in some sense artificial. And it's not that I stopped believing any of those things. Those just weren't the essence of my faith. And so what Jim would do, I can't say that I remember specific lessons. I don't have the best memory. And so I can definitely remember points he made, but I can't tell you that on October the 17th, 1994, this happened or something. But what I can say is it was a constant, you could even say dogged attempt to grab my attention and say, this is what Jesus is saying. You say you believe in him. Are you ready to follow him? And so that meant spending a lot of time in the Gospels and just talking about Jesus over and over and over again. And the thing that stood out to me was that I had some consciousness of what it meant in the 1990s in the Churches of Christ to be conservative or liberal, and I had been told enough to know to look out for the liberalism, you know. And the thing was, with Jim, he just talked about Jesus so much, and so I told him this years later. I had a problem, you know, when I was 19 years old. I couldn't figure out if Jim was conservative or liberal, and you know, the epiphany I had was, hey, it's not really about being those things. It's about following Jesus. And so the biggest gift that Jim gave to me and many generations is that he taught us that our faith is really about Jesus. And so he's the lens through which we view everything.
That's good. And then you became an intern and then a minister. And just briefly, how did that experience of your, you know, even as an intern, your start to be in the role of having to present Jesus to people, try to help form them spiritually, to be like Jesus. And then of course, as a campus minister and the other ministry roles that you've had, that you had to do that. So, I mean, how did that shape your understanding of Jesus, just being in those roles, or even just how did you, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. Great question.
Thank you.
You do best when you say less and you ask questions, Micah. No, I'm kidding. You know, Micah and I have a sarcastic relationship, a good, strong, sarcastic relationship. You know, what I didn't envision for my internship was that I was going to work with international students. And I don't remember exactly how that came about, but Jim tasked me with, we had some Chinese students who had been hanging around the ACSC because there were ping pong tables. They would come play ping pong, you know. Now, does that still happen? I mean, are there still ping pong tables down there?
There's two, but they've been, at various times they're deconstructed and used as tabletops. But yeah, so there's two that are often used.
I played a lot of ping pong down there back in the day, but when these so we're talking mid-90s, that's when this influx of Chinese students really started to pick up steam. Now, those Chinese students are very different than the current Chinese students. They had grown up in poverty and they had grown up in a very different world, you know, than the current. And the only reason I'm pointing this out is, so they were a window into a very different world that I'd never known before. So I was fascinated by it. But what I had to do was, you know, so we've got these Chinese students who are coming around. Are we going to miss this opportunity? And, you know, it wasn't all my effort, don't get me wrong, but it was clear that they wanted to speak English better. Yeah, that's how you say that. It's funny, I can't even think how to say it. And we were English speakers, and so they just wanted conversations, you know, so we could, so I do remember putting up a sign-up list, you know, about, hey, you want a conversation in English? We'll use the Bible. So it was up front. We're going to use the Bible and we're going to read through it together and we're going to talk about it. And so that was so new to me. I'd shared my faith before, but never in the, hey, let's start at ground one. And I want you to see what Christianity is about. And the truth was, they didn't have a clue what Christianity was about. They had been in American culture some. They knew some things from television. They'd had a few conversations here or there. But they certainly didn't know that this Jesus and the teachings of this man were the backbone of our faith. They saw it as, you know, just another religious crutch and this kind of thing. So kind of working through the questions with people who were you know, not antagonistic towards the Christian faith, but certainly didn't take it seriously, and building relationships while we were doing that. That was such a blessed time. And so Mary and I had started dating in 95 and we got married in 97. And so, you know, she was a part of that too. And and then the other interns, we were all part of it together. That was really formative in just learning how to do the basic building blocks of sit down with the Bible and talk about Jesus. Let's read some passages together. And so it really freed me in some sense. So I've never felt a great deal of guilt if I didn't have a great plan for how to study the Bible with somebody, because I figured out that the power is in the Word. And so let's just get in the Word together. Hey, I'm going to avoid the thorniest passages. We're not going to go to Ecclesiastes on day one or something like that. But let's just sit down and read the gospel together, and I can make an argument for all four of them being the best one to sit down and read. Sure, there's going to be lots of stuff that go over a non-believer's head. I'm sure there's plenty that goes over my head too. So that was, very formative there. Also, I probably wasn't the best at it. I learned counseling skills. I learned how to help people who were caught up in sin and who, were trying their best to beat old habits and that kind of stuff. And so I learned just some of the basics of ministry that really helped me. When we left Auburn, I went to be a youth minister in Winchester, Tennessee. And so I was working with a very different set of people then. Instead of working with young adults, I was working with people who still, had to answer to their parents and that kind of stuff. And so what I learned about myself was I don't like to deal with parents. And I don't say that to disparage the good people of Winchester, Tennessee. It's just that, I liked the relationship that I could build with college students because they're young adults. And that means they're making their own decisions for the most part. And that was a better fit for me.
Good. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a interesting thing. Just some of the parallels again. When I was an undergraduate, I was interacting and involved with the international outreach at Auburn. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's just amazing because sometimes you feel like a burden that you need to make the stories powerful for the person. Mm-hmm. You need to figure out the point that's going to kind of wow them, or the insight. And just getting to see someone encounter all those stories for the first time, and the power of them, and how quickly someone can come to not just believe in Jesus, not just have allegiance to Jesus, but for that to change them. Mm-hmm. And right. I think that to tie in with what we were talking about earlier, you do have this dynamic with a lot of Christians that even people in just our culture who aren't necessarily committed Christians, they know the stories of Jesus. They know the claims of Jesus. We've heard them. You grew up going to VBS and Christmas plays and whatnot. And I think at times we're in a dynamic where we have all these powerful stories, and as believers, we're trying to figure out how to make them exciting again to us. I mean, that's often the role of a minister. Mm-hmm. But to let somebody hear it for the first time, you can see how powerful Jesus is when you're not inoculated and numbed to that and to the stories and to what he did.
Exactly right, yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, you're now a theology professor. You got your PhD in New Testament studies, correct?
It's technically in theology, but it's
theology,
an emphasis on the New Testament. So
okay, and so you study your dissertation, right, or thesis, whatever, was on.
Well, since it's British, it's doctoral thesis, but
doctoral thesis, was on the Gospels, right? So
yeah.
I know much more narrow than that. We don't have to get into that. But what made you decide to continue to study the Gospels at such an academic level?
Yeah, so when I started attending, graduate classes at Lipscomb when I was an intern, and I fell in love with the academic study of the Bible. I'm kind of a nerd, and I've always been good at school, and so I guess it made sense if I wound up in a classroom, I was going to be interested in it. But this was something different. This was I realized that the Bible was central to our faith, and that I really couldn't have answered the question, what exactly are we doing when we open up the Bible? Now, I don't think a person necessarily needs to know the answer to that question to be able to share Jesus with someone. But at some point in your faith walk, you can't divorce the Bible from Jesus. And so it was a great concern to me that so many people could claim to see the Bible as their guide in faith and, the ultimate test of truth and that kind of thing, and yet come to very different conclusions on things, that kind of thing. I started to see more and more it's about what we're trying to do with the scriptures varies a lot. And we don't really do the hard work of answering what exactly is it that we're supposed to do with this book that God has given us. And so that's probably, that great interest was sparked when I was in grad school. And specifically, My dissertation was on the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called Synoptic Gospels because synoptic means to look at together, and they were, if you've read Matthew, Mark, and Luke before, you know they're very similar, have the same general outline, have some of the same stories, some of the same verbatim, statements from Jesus and other people, and yet they're very different in some ways too. And so there's a class with Mark Black on the Synoptic Gospels that really, I remember, I just started seeing, wait, I need to be able to know why it is we have 4 Gospels and why it and this kind of thing. So that was really the genesis of my interest in pursuing it to a greater degree. So that's how I wound up in doing a PhD and all that stuff.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, I mean, as Christians, we believe in Jesus, and our insight, our main kind of portal into seeing who he is these 4 Gospels. And they're similar but different, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So just trying to get at why they're different, how they're similar, why they're presented that way, and letting that inform your further study of Jesus. So go ahead, you're about to say something.
No, I wasn't. I was just agreeing. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. So in your academic study, is there anything about Jesus? Are there any passages that you have come to see with a new kind of set of eyes, or maybe an emphasis that Jesus has that you think is important for us that you began to see through the academic deeper study of Jesus?
Okay, well, if you don't mind, let me first of all say one of the things, since I kind of I punted on the question originally, let me come back to it. When I talked about in college, when Jim B talked about, we go through a gospel together and kind of focusing on Jesus, I do remember a very formative time in my life when it was focused on the Sermon on the Mount, and where I started to see that as kind of the essence of Christianity, because this is what Jesus envisions his kingdom to be like. And so I committed to memory a lot of the Sermon on the Mount. I can't remember if I did the whole thing or not. I can't recite it all now, but I do remember learning, hey, if I'm going to seek to follow Jesus, this is the longest teaching block from Jesus in the whole Bible. So Matthew 5, 6, and 7, almost all 3 chapters. If you've got a red letter Bible, they're all red letters, right? With very few exceptions. And so that was important to me because I knew that to say I was a Christian meant something about trying to live out this ethic. With the academic study of the Bible, what I'd say is this. In our greater evangelical heritage, the emphasis is on making a decision for Jesus, right? And so it's very much if you died tonight, where would you go, right? Where would your soul wind up in eternity, heaven or hell? And we've probably all been in situations where something like that was posed to us in a church setting, or from someone like that. And I don't think that those are wrong questions, and I don't think necessarily that's the wrong way to frame it. But if that's the only way you see your relationship with Jesus is a transactional basis, where yes, I will believe in you and you will give me eternal life. Yes, I deserve to die, but you died in my place. Those are very, very basic fundamental things that aren't really enough to sustain faith. Instead, look at what Jesus does in the Gospels when he calls someone. It's not believe in me and I'll give you heaven. It's follow me. And so the thing that stands out to me about academic study of the scriptures is that with all the debates over, there are a lot of liberal academics, and so they're going to want to tear apart the scriptures or want to tell you why maybe this part didn't really happen and that kind of stuff. But move past that, and you see that there was this movement in the first century of these Jewish people who became so convinced that this guy named Jesus, who was an unimportant Galilean preacher, was somehow their Messiah and the very Son of God, and they were willing to bet everything on it. And from that little small group of inconsequential people, we have now over 2 billion people in the world claiming some kind of allegiance to Jesus. So there's something there, and it starts with appreciating what was so different about what Jesus was calling people to. So if I had to pick a passage, it would be Luke 4, where Jesus is baptized, and then he goes into his home synagogue and reads from the scroll of Isaiah And if you want a vision for how Jesus painted a picture of what he was about, then it's recovery of sight for the blind, setting prisoners free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's what salvation is. It's not just being saved from hell, but it's a life that is beyond the disease of sin, beyond the the corrupting influence of Satan. And so it's a full existence, not just in this life, in the age to come too. And so that's where if you get past a lot of the scholarly debates over this and that, you kind of start to see a big, fulsome picture of what it means what the gospel, why it really is good news.
That's good. So I know that we have about 10 to 12 minutes left for our interview, and I have 3 questions for you that I want to ask. The first one is, and maybe you were kind of getting close to it there, but with all your study and all your years of trying to explain Jesus to people, if you were to sit down and talk to somebody that doesn't have a background in, say, American culture and understanding Jesus, going back to, again, an international student or just someone who is from, say, even a Western Europe country and just isn't really familiar with it, how would you succinctly describe Jesus to them?
Sure. So let me say this. When I was at Auburn, I went on a mission campaign to Jamaica, and no, we didn't just go play on the beach. We went and we did some good. But I remember Jim B and the missionary who went with us having a philosophical discussion about bringing someone to Jesus, or that's not probably the right way to say it, but helping someone find Jesus or whatever. And their disagreement was over Jesus or the Bible. Okay, it went like this. Jim B said, you start with Jesus, and then after they start to see why they need Jesus, then we bring the Bible in and say, hey, this is why Jesus calls us to submit to the scriptures. Whereas the other guy made the point that, well, we need to first get them to say that they believe what the Bible says and want to do what it says, and then we introduce Jesus. Now, philosophically, they're different approaches. Neither one is exactly right and exactly wrong, because they're going to work together. But to me, I'm going to side with Jim B more. But part of the reason for that is, like you said just a moment ago, I'm not clever enough to be able to get into a person's heart and know the message they need to hear at that moment. I wish I was, but I'm just not that guy. Okay, so instead, what I need to do is just let the scripture speak. So what I've done in the past is I usually sit down with the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Mark. Okay, now let me tell you, doing academic study of the Bible means that as you're reading through, there are a million things that are going off in my head about what this person doesn't know, or about what they might think, or something like that. Almost always they ask questions that have nothing to do with what I've thought about, Because so when we read from the Gospel of John and it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's John 1:1. Then I immediately am going, well, Genesis 1:1 starts off in the beginning. So John is making a nod to the fact that this is like, the creation. And any Jew of Jesus' day would have understood that, right? And then to say he was the Word, the Logos, well, the Logos has a long history in Greek Greek thought, but also in Jewish thought. And so I'm thinking about those things, and they're going to ask a question that has nothing to do with any of that, because that stuff is not really how someone comes to know Jesus. Okay, so I would just advise sitting down. Any of the Gospels is good. Mark, because it's short. John, because it jumps directly into some of the bigger issues of who Jesus is. You've immediately got Jesus being God in John chapter 1, verse 1. Whereas you've got in the other Gospels an incremental approach to helping you understand who Jesus is. Either way, I think is good, but that's what I advise doing. Now, at the North Boulevard, where I'm a member, we use Discovery Bible Study. And I do think that that's a helpful thing to use if you got someone who has expressed an interest in a discipling relationship of some kind, then I think a DBS might be a good approach. But if you got someone who's just, you've got to sit down and you don't know much, and they don't know much, just read gospel together.
So instead of, is what you're saying that you want to resist at some level trying to give somebody your view of Jesus because you just want to try to take them to text. I mean,
Yeah.
again, if
that does remind me, you asked me how I would succinctly do
yeah.
that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let me get back to that now.
Okay.
I distracted myself with my own answer.
It's a great answer, though.
Yeah, sure. So the way I would explain Jesus today, I might say something different tomorrow, would be that God loves you, and he so wants to be in relationship with you,
Mm-hmm.
and for you to live a full life, that he became human to not only teach you what that good life is like,
Mm-hmm.
but to show you, to demonstrate what real love is.
Mm-hmm.
I would put a heavy emphasis on love, because I don't think there are a lot of theological statements I can make about Jesus that don't make sense without love.
That's good. So a couple more questions. One is, so I know it's been, almost 30 years since you've been a college student, correct?
Dude. Yeah.
It's been almost 30 years.
I finished my PhD in 2012.
Well, that's right.
Okay?
That's right.
When were you
So
last in college? Oh, wait, you're still in college.
Yeah. So, so I know it might be hard for you to get the mindset of a college student, and also just watching the different ways cultures change, different pressures on them, and churches have changed, and so forth, so on. But what do you think is the biggest aspect of Jesus that college students today would be tempted to ignore? Or, what do you think the biggest thing in culture that college students might accept that would lead them to ignore Jesus? So you can either be an aspect of Jesus that they're ignoring, or something in culture that's blinding them to see Jesus.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So I will say this: what I said about God and love and Jesus, I think our culture is perfectly fine with that, right? Yeah. That anybody is good with saying Jesus taught love. All right. So that's not earth-shattering in any way. It's important to me to communicate love, because I do think when people see in our culture who aren't Christians, think of Christians, they don't think, the first thing they think of is not love. All right, they tend to think of something else, and I want to fix that. Whatever we need to do to fix that, okay? But however, having said that, what we mean by love could be very different, and so the fact that believing in Jesus might be easy, honestly, to say, yeah, sure, fine, he's Son of God. Okay, yeah, good. It's following him. I think that's the part, because that really makes demands on our lives. And the discipleship part is just neglected. And our churches need to be talking about discipleship more. And we need to be making disciples. And that starts with me, okay? So I'm not trying to be overly critical of anyone, but the idea that you can accept the proposition of Jesus and then move on with your life is probably one that our culture is very guilty of, and maybe a college student today has seen that demonstrated in lots of ways. And so,
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
So I mean, I know it's like a trite way of saying it, but I've heard people put it that people want Jesus as a savior, but not as a Lord.
Absolutely.
We want him to save us from hell, but we don't necessarily want his teachings to be what dictate our lives. Hey, so the last question, I know there's so much more that you have to say, and so much more that the students and I and everyone watching this could learn from you. But let's say that you're talking to someone that was raised in a Christian family, but is in college or coming to college as a freshman, and that they want to encounter Jesus, kind of see him freshly, listen to the claims that he's made, and they've never really studied a gospel or never really kind of walked through all that, maybe just had the experience that you and I were describing earlier of not really as cognizant of following Jesus as they are of a set of beliefs, or say even ethical teachings that they're just trying to abide by. How would you encourage that student to come to a deeper knowledge or deeper encounter with Jesus?
Okay, great question. I accidentally discovered this in my life, and since then I've learned that it's biblical, and that is in the model of discipleship. We all need to be discipled by someone, and we all need to be discipling someone. So God has always presented me with people who it's clear you've got something I need, and I need to learn from you. in college that was Jim Brinkerhoff, was also some older college students. Okay. So the reason I came to Auburn was because people like Brian Harden and Emily Turner Goodman, were influential in the way I thought, and Kelly Harden and other people too. I could mention several, but they were the beginnings of disciplers for me. Okay. It's the best they could when they were 18, 19 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and Jim Brinkerhoff was a huge influence, but there were several others along the way. So the best thing that I've done for myself is to learn that I can't learn Jesus in isolation. So if I just want to get alone with the scriptures and just me study them, and I'm going to figure out Jesus and I'm going to develop a relationship with Jesus, it just doesn't work. I need community. So I need people who can teach me more about this Jesus, because questions come up. Okay. It sounds really pithy to say, yes, go read the Bible, read about Jesus. There are so many puzzling things in the Gospels that you need somebody to help kind of think through them, right? Jesus made some statements that are really shocking. And by the way, that's the thing, probably the American church, we're probably not really ready to hear some of the things Jesus says because they're so shocking and demanding sometimes. But, and so that's the first thing. The second thing is to also be discipling someone else means that I'm going to have to try to take this same Jesus and make him real to someone else. And as you know, you'll never learn anything better than when you have to teach it, right? That's when you truly start to, things start to click. And so I'd say what Mary and I encountered at the Christian Student Center at Auburn was an opportunity to be discipled and to disciple other people. And in that sense, we built a community that we didn't know what we had until we lost it. And so, Micah, since you're in the thick of this, it's probably not quite as obvious to you as it is to those of us who are my age and older and even younger. Once you leave the community like you have at the ACSC, you'll find that you're craving that again, because it doesn't just happen. Life stages change and commitments change and all this kind of stuff, but trying to build a place where you can actually be discipled and make disciples is that's precious. And so take advantage of the time in college, especially, to build those kind of relationships. So the way our youth minister, David Skidmore, would say it is everybody needs a Paul in their life and everybody needs a Timothy in their life. Needs someone to disciple us and someone to disciple.
Yeah, it's that's good, because I think maybe we often have a paradigm of learning, just kind of increasing information. And so how do you learn more about Jesus where you just go study? And but then there's a whole aspect, not that that's in and of itself bad. I mean, I'm nerdy, you're nerdy, we like studying. But if I understand you correctly, one of the best ways to encounter Jesus and grow to a deeper knowledge of him is to apprentice to somebody who's doing the same, and maybe is a step or two ahead of you. One of the verses that we use a lot in our ministry, because one of the top goals for our ministry is for people to encounter Jesus, but another top goal is for people to be in a discipling culture. And one of the verses we use a lot is Philippians 3:17, where Paul says, "Join with others in following my example, brothers, and take note of those who live according to the pattern we gave you." And so another way of saying that is, look at Jesus as a pattern, but also look at people who are living according to that pattern.
Absolutely. That's right.
And so that's good. I appreciate you sharing that. And so is there any is there any way that students can follow you if they want to find more information? I've seen you on Twitter posting some really interesting things.
Yeah, I don't have a great social media presence, so probably not that way.
And your academic papers, I've seen you have one on the names of people in the first century Palestine and eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, so I do.
That's exciting.
You can Google Michael Strickland, Amridge University, and I've got an academia.edu page, and so some of my published work is there.
So students, y'all can read that for devotional. It's a great way to dive deeper.
Yeah, sure. You can take some classes at Amridge. I'd be glad to.
It's in Montgomery, for those of you who don't know.
Yeah, it's in Montgomery. I live in Tennessee, though, but it's all online. We use Zoom for our classes.
Oh,
so, yeah, we were cool before everybody else knew about Zoom.
And if they're interested, you've published a book. How much does that cost?
Oh wait,
it's a very expensive book. I'm joking with Michael.
They're library books. I would
Michael gets all the profit. It's like he gets like $75 a copy. So
no, that's not the way it works.
is it not? That's why professors are so rich. Michael, I appreciate you taking time. For those of you who followed us all the way to this end of the conversation, I'll just say that this is the second time Michael and I've talked because I messed up the recording on the first one. So I appreciate
he forgot to ask me about LeBron and MJ. So I think we need to get that in 30 seconds or less.
Oh yeah, 30 seconds. Yeah, I asked him a quick round, but who's better, LeBron or MJ?
Okay, MJ is, and I'm going to give you the quick version, which is compare their offensive stats, and you can make arguments either way. MJ is a better defensive player. He led the league in steals 3 years. He was all defensive. He was the defensive player of the year 1 year. Same year he led the league in scoring. LeBron just doesn't compare when it comes to that. So when you look at a full basketball player, MJ's better.
Awesome. And I'll end on a more controversial one. If you had to cut one Auburn program, basketball or football, and you could cut one and keep one, which one would you cut? Because you're a bigger basketball fan like I am. Which one would you cut? You gotta that's what we're gonna end on.
No, all my good memories are in, well, not all, but most of them are with football because we weren't a basketball school.
That is true.
I actually tried out for the Auburn basketball team. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I tried out. And failed miserably.
But you ended up as a math educator, so I think we see how that worked out for you.
That's right. Yeah, I couldn't make the worst team in the SEC. Yeah, remember that.
At the time, that's true.
If I had to cut, I'd have to cut basketball. But at the moment, I mean, that's like splitting the baby in half. I just wouldn't do it.
That's true. That's true. All right. Well, Michael, I appreciate it. Students, you can go and try to take class with him. That'd be really great for you guys to do. Sure. And get in contact with him on Facebook or Twitter if you have any questions for him. And if you're in our ministry say you're coming in, you're going to have 4 more years here, chances are you'll have a chance to hear Michael teach because every year or two we invite him to teach for us. So anyway, appreciate it, Michael. Thanks for sharing all that. And thanks to all of you for listening to our first podcast interview for the summer. Thanks.